specific questions that you've never heard. And I love this. This is why I like talking to people who really get it. People then heard me first before they saw me. And I think that's really important because it gives you the opportunity to be great. A little tip off of how much the human connection matters is what I was missing as an announcer. And now I just see it everywhere. That is the only thing really remaining in my career is somebody saying, you are going to do our biggest event. The most important thing I can convey to anybody who's doing anything is...
First of all, this is my voice. I'm Tim Green and I have ALS. This podcast is not about ALS or living with disabilities. I don't want you to feel sorry for me. I don't feel sorry for me. I am a father of 5 with a marriage that's lasted for over 33 years. I am a #1 New York Times best-selling author of 41 books, an NFL first-round pick with an 8-year career. I worked on TV for Fox Sports, Good Morning America, Court TV, and Extra. I've hosted BattleBots, A Current Affair, and Find My Family. And I am also a practicing attorney. In this podcast, we're diving into real-life stories. From triumphs to trials, we'll explore the extraordinary in the ordinary. Join me, Tim Green, and my son Troy each week for real conversations, laughter, and insights. Because life is a journey, and everyone's got a story. My voice in today's episode is powered by 11 Labs. Jason Benetti, you are a big-time announcer with Fox Sports. You have a smooth baritone voice, and you are as sharp as broken glass. You have a law degree from Wake Forest and an undergraduate degree from the Newhouse School at Syracuse University. You started out small, but by sheer force of will, you worked your way up to realizing your childhood dream, and nobody gave you anything along the way. Your father was not chairman of the board. You got no lucky break. You earned every ounce of it.
My lucky break was doing Skinny Atlas High School football games, guys. That was my lucky break. Was doing the Class C champions. I believe it was Class C, if I'm remembering correctly. No, thank you so much for the lovely intro, Tim. It's really kind of you. And I honestly, truly could not be happier to be with both of you today.
We feel the same way. Please tell us what happened to you as an infant that was so unique.
Yeah, a lot of things seemed to happen to me as a kid. I got sick when I was very young, and there was a doctor in Chicago who has since passed. Her name was Dr. Diana Wu, and she was the person who, as the story is told to me, I'm a curious person about everybody else's stories, but I've never really fully dug into all of the how and why. But Dr. Wu was the person who kept me alive, and my family kept her very close for a long while until she passed when I was older as a kid. But I got ill. It was very touch and go for a while. And then I had multiple surgeries. I had a surgery on my eyes. As you see, I have an eye that drifts, and my vision's a little bit different just in terms of how it puts the picture together than the average person, I guess you could say. But hamstring surgery, heel cord surgery, among others. And I was in a wheelchair for a little while as a first grader, which was really fun for all the classmates getting to that's the way you want to get pushed around as a kid, right? That's the best version of being pushed around. But no, it was a number of surgeries until about third grade. There was a summer where I was in a couple of leg casts for the entire summer. But after that, generally, I was I've been fortunate to be fairly healthy, but I was pretty sick as a kid. So there are some pictures of me wearing the plastic version of the Forrest Gump leg braces that fly off in the movie, right? Like Forrest Gump goes running and the braces just fly off. And I'm here to tell you that doesn't actually happen.
Jason, when you were young, did you understand I'm getting these surgeries to help make me better, or were you just I want this, I want the surgeries to stop?
Yeah, it's funny. I don't really have. I have recollections of everything but the surgery. And it gets to be so routine. I mean, I think our lives overlap in this way that no matter what life is, the routine becomes normalcy. And so for me, it was like you're in surgery, you go to the pre-op appointment, you go to have the surgery done, and then you wake up and you're in the Rehabilitation Institute of Chicago. And like, then you're there with the nurses and you're there with the doctors and you go see your friends there and you have lunch on a calendar and there are video games or not. And the person next to you in the room is loud or not. And your parents show up and they love you. And then you get out of the hospital or Rehabilitation Institute of Chicago and then you go to school again. And that was just kind of the regular cadence for me. So, until I was an adult and heard all these people talking about like, I went to summer camp and we went kayaking and all that stuff. It was like, no, my summer was figuring out how good the male nurse's impression of Donald Duck was.
When my younger brother, he had his eye, an adult was throwing a boomerang and didn't see him. He like kind of wandered behind them, and when they brought the boomerang back, the point hit him right in the eye, and it detached. He had a detached retina and all that stuff, and he had to have a couple eye surgeries. And I remember he was going in for what ended up being like the last one. And he said to my parents, and I don't know why it's so stuck in my head, because he was just a little kid. I don't know how old he was, probably 8 years old, maybe even, I don't even know. But anyways, he said to my parents, he's like, can I just stop? Like, I don't care if my eye gets better or not. I don't want to do any more surgeries. And my parents like, you got to just, my dad, you got to just trust us. When you're older, you won't even remember any of this, and it'll be just a barely a memory, and you'll be happy that you did it. And now his eyes, thankfully are in good shape and all that. But I didn't know if if it was like a fatigue thing that you had as well.
I do. It's so interesting you say this. I so often get interviewed by people who have had pretty clean bills of health as kids and don't fully understand, or clean bills of health as adults and have not had some sort of longitudinal illness, right? And I don't know if that was true or not when I was a kid, if I was tired of it or whatever it might be. You brought up a memory that I haven't thought of for a long, long time. But there was one night after his surgery that they had to keep my legs like out wide. So they had some version of a device where like I was just basically like doing the splits all night. I have no recollection of which surgery it was. I don't know how old I was, but I do have this memory of being like, I hope this is over at some point, because this is like the least comfortable I have ever been. I have more of these like Larry David annoyance memories more than anything. Like, oh, that those casts were itchy, or like it's annoying to put on these braces every morning, or truly, Mom, I got a pen stuck in my cast again. Because locking in with attention for me in that department as a kid wasn't great. But I think I now, as I think back about it, I do have a lot of memories. The one place I am fortunate is that I've known this my entire life. And so what this has been has not really materially changed. And I think that's a difference from most illness. Like I got sick as a kid, very, very young, to the point where I do not remember that portion of the program. But then after that, I just sort of have lived with it. And thankfully, I think where I would have been, as you're talking about your brother, Troy, is if I had like one more surgery. This was third grade. I had my last surgery. And I think I was pretty naive. And I also didn't really ever have like athletic aspirations in any way, shape, or form, because I just never was able to do that with all the surgeries I was having. If one more would have happened, I bet you I would have had the very same experience you're describing.
Yeah. And then I promise we won't talk the whole time about this, but you said a lot of things that are like triggered memories for me. But it's interesting too, the perspective you said of eventually like the routine becomes normal. Like now when people reach out to me, a lot of my dad's, friends or colleagues or people that know our family, whatever, and they say like, oh, how's he doing? And when they first say, I'm like, oh, did something happen? I don't know. But it's like, it's almost like jarring at first. I'm like, oh crap, this thing. And then, it's like he's had ALS now since 2016. It's been 8 years, and it's not, and he's been, we're really lucky that he's been relatively stable for a good chunk of those. And, it doesn't feel like anything different, right? It feels like routine. It feels like normal. So yeah,
Well, I mean,
it's an interesting perspective. I think the two of you guys have more than most people out there. And I have kind of third party just being close to it, but it is an interesting, like I said, interesting perspective.
what I would say, Troy, though, is like, no matter what illness, disease, brain function issue, whatever it might be, I do tend to believe family members feel it just about as deeply as us, as the people who are dealing with it, because your level of care and your level of love never changes, but your understanding of the person that you're dealing with is immense. And so I was just at a Cerebral Palsy Foundation event a couple weeks ago at the beginning of November. And one of the things that struck me about all the speakers at the front of the room that night was the depth of emotion, like just the depth of true human feeling. And I've had so many people, not only with disabilities, but family members of people with disabilities say, my empathy is now off the charts. Like my patience is off the charts. My understanding of the human condition is off the charts. And I don't think you should ever shortchange, like, oh, I don't have this, and so I'm not, as emotionally invested. I don't feel it. I actually think family members and friends feel it with equal, maybe even more depth. Like I have all of these situations that have happened in my life, and I'm pretty fortunate for people with CP, as people with CP go. In terms of my physical challenges at this point in my life, they are few, but my walking does not look quote unquote normal. And I have all of these instances where somebody who's with me has a completely outsized reaction to something really silly and small and dumb that another person has done. Like they are acting as me, but with some multiplier. And I do think that's a really powerful indicator of how deep the human condition is.
Yeah, no, I think it's powerful. My dad and I still argue just like we did beforehand. So we still bicker at each other. So I don't know if my patience is up, and I don't think his patience is up with me. But
Not yet, and yet is the key word. Jason, did you grow up with any brothers or sisters?
Tim, when you get it so right the first time, there's no reason to go any further. I mean, look, it's the whole thing is perfection. The eyes, the lack of shaving today. I mean, they saw right out of the gate. They were like, you know what? Who needs another one when you have this? No, I think they figured that I was just going to be such a handful that they thought, oh, I mean, I don't know if we want to do this again. No, it's just me. I'm an only child. And I do think, my parents deserve a ton of credit because they were there all the time, hours upon hours upon hours, and just sitting there and like trying to ward off the lady with the basket of syringes as much as possible. Like, you don't have to draw blood again, sort of thing, right? And just encouraging me to go be whatever. I mean, no, I don't have brothers and sisters. But I think at points my parents were dealing with me and my stuff medically enough for two kids.
Looking back on it now, do you think your parents were overprotective of you?
The only thing that I would challenge in that sentence is the past tense of were. I'm 41 and I think they worry every time I get on a plane. Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question that truly nobody has ever asked me in an interview, and I do think that's true, and I don't blame them in any way for being that, because when your kid has a brush with death, I do think there's a sense of, well, let's make sure he's okay. And I do think, and I say this because There are people with disabilities who I'm certain are out there who just love their parents very deeply, but don't always want to be like wards of the state, if that makes some sense. Like I never, once I got to be of teenage age, I wanted to show everybody, including myself and my parents, that I could live on my own, that I could do this all on my own. And so that's a source of conflict. My parents and I love each other very deeply. But there are some times where I just want to be myself. And I say that because I do think that there are people out there who have disabilities who probably feel the same way. Like I could not love my parents any more than I do. But there are times where I just want to be me as well, like unfettered, unshackled me. And so I appreciate the heck out of the fact that they were protective and they never really told me like, well, you have this condition and this is this. And it was just go outside, play basketball with your friends. You want to be a sports announcer? Go be a sports announcer, which, you know, if you think about like the probability, if there were draft kings back then for like young sports announcers, it's not going to be like minus 350. I'm not like the Lions to win the Super Bowl right now as a 15-year-old to become a sports announcer. And I'm frankly very glad that that was the case, because I think if you get told that you're kind of at the back of the line, I think you start to act a little bit like you're at the back of the line, or that the industry could treat you in such a way. But that's why I'm really grateful for so many people who just said, yeah, you know what? Like, you want to be something? Go be it. And my parents were the first ones to do that.
It's so important to have that support from loved ones. Jason, do you remember the first time you realized that you had a disability?
Oh, wow. You are full of great questions that I've truly, literally never been asked. You know, like you guys know, right? You do all these interviews in whatever job you have, and people ask you the same stuff and they do it in a different way, but they don't really ever engage in like specific questions that you've never heard. And I love this. I love this is why I like talking to people who really get it, in terms of like having stuff that can be a roadblock in your life, whether in perception or physically. And so, do I remember the first time? I I I remember the first time somebody mentioned it, a student, and it actually computed with me, because I do think for a while as a kid it was just like, I'm Jason and I have braces and like all this stuff, and I don't really remember people, um I don't remember it being a thing. But I, in retrospect, now realize like teachers did stuff because, or, you know, there was like, I used to, I used to get to go to the front of the kickball line in gym class because we'd like run to a spot to go get in line. And they always knew that I wasn't going to be fast enough to get in line first. So I'd end up just not, you know, kicking the ball ever. So it was basically like opening the inning with an out. But that the first time I remember somebody saying something, I had a classmate say to me, "Where are you looking?" And I was like, "At you, doofus." Like, of course I'm looking at you. And I had no idea my eyes were different. And then he said, "Yeah, like I don't know where you're looking." And I remember going home and thinking like the rest of the day, what is he talking about? And I never brought it up to my parents, but I do now remember that as basically the first like vivid moment when somebody said something about that being. I'm sure there are a ton of others that I just didn't track, but that was the first one that really, it was like seventh grade science class.
Do you remember the first time somebody teased you as a kid?
Uh, so, uh, the, I had this shop teacher in middle school, Mr. Menig, and he was an awesome human being. And I've mentioned him before to other people because he didn't make he was also the basketball coach for the, I want to say, the eighth grade basketball team. So he knew I liked sports and wanted me to be a part of the basketball team. but not as just the manager who like picks up all, the cliched person with a disability who like picks up all the jerseys and throws the stuff in and everybody pats him on the head and everything. Like, he made me the assistant coach for the team. So I would like draw up plays, whatever you draw up for an 8th grade basketball team, and like call out zone defenses from the sideline. And I'm sure it was quite the sight. But I remember we went on a road game and I was sitting in the crowd waiting for the 7th grade game to end and waiting for our game to start. And there was a movie out at the time called Dumb and Dumber with Jim Carrey and Jeff Daniels. It was a box office smash. I have to say it like that because more and more I live, the more I feel old and people don't know movies that they should know. So there is this movie called Dumb and Dumber. And in the movie, they kind of like bilk a young kid who's blind out of like his bird. There's like a problem with his bird, like they like accidentally drop the bird. I don't remember exactly what happens, but he's sitting there at the end of the scene and he's like patting the parrot on the head and he's saying "pretty bird" over and over again. It's his blind kid. The bird's dead and he doesn't know that the bird's dead, but he's saying "pretty bird." And I remember these kids at this stupid middle school doing that to me. I'm not even like, you're not even close on the right disability. I can see you fine, and I certainly can hear you doing it. But like, that was the first time I think I remember somebody saying something that specifically about a disability. But, this has led to an entire life of people not having any clue what I can or can't do. Like, no joke, 2 days ago, I get to the airport and I'm taking a cab because the Uber terminal is like one terminal over. So I'm old school. I get in a cab and it's a van, right? And like there are a lot of people who use wheelchairs. I have no issue with any of that. We're talking here. We have different disabilities. We have different needs, whatever it is. I personally do not use a wheelchair. So I get to the van and the guy, before putting my bag in the back seat, takes the wheelchair ramp and puts it out for me as though I can't cross the curb. Like, I thought, what in the world? His brain just breaks. And I don't know if you guys have this experience, but like, as somebody, we both, Tim, you and I function fine in the world. Like, I know you have your challenges, I have my challenges in the world, but your brain works, my brain works, everything's good here. People's brains break when they run into people with disabilities. That just happens.
Yeah, I know my dad has something. I know he's going to ask you about this later, I think, but he has people come up to him all the time and they look at him and they go really close to his face and they talk really loud and they're like, "Hi, Tim." And then they look at me or my mom or whoever's there and they're like, "Can he hear me?" And it's like, yes. Yes, he can hear you.
And he's so mad at you right now. You don't even know it. I get that at the airport sometimes where people will be like, "This is pre-check. Do you know this is pre-check?" I'm like, "What? How do you think I got to the airport? Like, what is happening here?"
I think we're in different. This is where we have a good different perspective, Jason, because my dad's is obviously later on in life and you've had it your whole life. I think, or almost your life. I think that before my dad had ALS, I didn't know anything. I knew way considerably less about disabilities. Also, too, I was, in like kind of a crucial 8 years of maturity and growing up and all that. But I do think that it's like a lot of people just don't know. I didn't know anything about ALS until I saw the Ice Bucket Challenge. I didn't do it. I heard about it. I saw people doing it. And I heard about Steve Gleason when the Falcons would play the Saints. I would see him there. But I didn't know anything more than that. So we always say, like, we don't blame people for it, but it's hard not to be like, come on. Sometimes.
No, I'm in the same place as you guys. Totally. Like, I think people mean really well. I don't think they're being nasty in any way. I just wish there was some way to explain to them, yes, this is the first time you're experiencing me, but this is the 9 millionth time I'm experiencing what you're doing to me. And
That's
so
right.
If you sense that I'm getting like slightly to moderately frustrated, just understand there's a giant pile of you in the corner that I've had to deal with. And like, get over yourself for me, right? Like, life is fine. They don't mean anything by it. But at some point, when it happens over and over again, and then you
Yeah.
either see your friends have different experiences with the same person, or Tim, in your case, you led a very full life without ALS, and people wouldn't have responded to you that way. But now there's, this physical condition, but your brain is still like the processor that it used to be. I can only begin to comprehend how frustrating that is. But I do think you're right, Troy. People mean well. It's not like
Yeah.
aggressive in any way. It's all super helpful. But that, like, at some point, it's like, can we just talk to people like real human beings? Thanks.
I wonder too, and I don't know. There's probably someone out there smarter than me on this that could opine to it. But I wonder too if my dad not having it until he's later in life, in his 50s, it's like you're not going to have the seventh grade, middle school kids from the rival high school or middle school teasing you, right? So I think you're probably, I don't know, but you've had the 9 million experiences. Let's say my dad's had 9,000 or whatever, like the different lengths. But it's interesting to think about. I don't know, the perspective there, because my dad didn't really. It's not like he had to deal with that. Kids are so ruthless, and
Yeah,
yeah,
they are. But you also just understand a lot of this is just simply that nobody has time to think about anything that's coming at them, right? Anybody who works at an airport or a restaurant or whatever has 1,000 things to do. And then here we come and they're just doing whatever their brain is telling them to do. And they kind of
sure,
want to move on and get the chips and guac to the other table, right? Like, they don't really want to get into a whole like moral compass discussion about how you should treat people with CP or ALS. Like, they just, and then they try to like do something that's kind of nice and a little bit out of their way, and they do it wrong. And then here we are waiting to be like, "Whoa, little do you know how bad that was." So I think it's just all, that's why I think I like sitcoms and stand-up comedies so much, because it's all based on misunderstandings. Like, I really do understand like the basic Full House episode from the 90s, because it's all like, oh, this all could have been solved if somebody just said the DJ left that note for Steve, right? Instead of,
yeah,
oh, it's so frustrating and it makes us all mad. I do think, when my patience wears thin and I let go some of the frustration, it's about 3 minutes later that I'm like, why did I do that? They're just trying to be nice.
Jason, did you ever have someone who tried to protect you, someone who stood up to the bullies?
Uh, Everybody who has made my TV career happen, I think. And that's not exactly, I think, what you're driving at. But as a kid, it wasn't like an 80s movie, right? Where people are like throwing me into lockers and things like that. It was just simply like, you're different and we're going to point it out at points. But the way my brain processes that, Tim, is that I think a lot of people in this world, until something exists, don't believe it can exist. And I don't blame them for that. That's how we end up with new ideas. And it also is how we organize this crazy world we live in. But there are people in the television industry who, have this silly requirement that you can look directly at a camera, right? Like, there's that whole Nixon Kennedy debate where it's just so obvious how the TV medium affected the presidential race of that year. And it's in part because how you carry yourself on television is how you transmit yourself to the public, and people are going to assume things. So I don't blame anybody for thinking like, hey, I don't know that I want him to be on television or whatever it might be. But I would say the people who have vouched for me in my television career, it's not like they stood up to bullies per se, but they also stood up to what the norm was and shoved it somewhere else. And I appreciate that endlessly, the first person to really do it for me was the guy who was the producer of those Time Warner cable high school football games that we all were involved in, right, in the 2010s. Pete Gaines was his name. Pete's this enormous, lovable teddy bear of a human being with a gray beard and just like the warmest personality you could possibly dream up. And he was our producer for the Syracuse Chiefs games when we were on television at the time. And Pete uh, appreciated my work, and I will always appreciate him for that. And he pushed for me to be on those high school football games. And it was my first television experience that was in any way outside of what was just mandated because I was the voice of the Chiefs at the time. And so Pete stood up for me with everybody in that corporation. And it turned into my career at ESPN by sending that tape to some people at ESPN. I ended up getting some ESPN basketball. My first game was a Cuse game at the Carrier Dome. And then, I got to do more and more at ESPN. But in that time, I called an executive at another network, and that person watched my reel and said, he said, "How much radio have you done?" And I said, "Well, a lot of it. That's where I got my start." And he said back to me, "Well, you should really keep working at that." Which, like, let's just be honest. We know what you mean when you say somebody should be on radio, right? He's not great to look at, which is fine. It's his own prerogative. And actually, that person is a friend of mine now, and I do not believe remembers he said that to me. So we're going to go ahead and keep it clandestine ops with who said that. But I would say that there have been a lot of people. I mean, I have had people at networks say, "Hey, I don't know that we discriminated early on, but it took a little while for us to understand what you are." And I know that's going to be a little bit of a fact of life of my career. But yeah, Tim, to your question, it was much less like friends who stood up to people when I was younger, and much more people who stood up to an industry that has its ways and has its norms and all of that.
In the TV business, it almost always takes a village to make it as far as you have. Can you please tell us the story of the marching band?
I was a tuba player as a kid because, you walk around with a disability and you want to like beat the odds and whatnot. So they asked what instrument I wanted to play in band, and I said the tuba, and they said, "Well, you're a dope, right? Like that's heavy. You probably don't want to play the tuba, whatever it might be." So I go into band, and I'm decent enough at the tuba, and there are only like two of them, so they kind of need us anyway, and we're just going to sort of driving the beat. But you know. There were two moments where playing the tuba became an issue for me. One was in middle school, where we would march as a band in the parade locally in lovely Homewood, Illinois. And we would, have our instruments, and we'd wear the hats with the funny feathers and all that stuff. So the band director decided that I was not going to be wearing a sousaphone, like the tuba that goes around your waist. And so he decided that he was going to make me the drum major for the band. Right. And so the primary and really only reason for a drum major is to make sure all of the kids behind you are on the beat. So their left foot and right foot hit the pavement at the right time. Never in life have my feet hit the pavement at the right time. It is the thing that I am worst at in life. So like we have pictures of me, right? And I'm all happy. I'm thrilled to be at the front of the band, but I assume behind me there are pictures of just children piled up in like a 30-car wreck because they have no idea when the downbeat is. So thankfully, in high school, the band director decided that wasn't going to be a good idea to make me one of the drum majors. So he started by putting like a tuba on a stand, and I'd go out at halftime of the football game and I'd march in time with my tuba, but not move. So I'd just stand by the tuba, and then all the kids like went in orbit around me. Like I was like, it was like a planet and sun moon situation. Right. So that was silly too, because everybody's watching that and they're like, I'm enjoying the performance, but that poor kid down there, there's all that stuff that goes on. So he decided that I would be the announcer for the band. And I went up to the top of the stands and went into the press box, and it was the first time I was ever behind a microphone. And I distinctly remember some guy there just being like, "Hey, you're kind of good at this." One of the teachers who was doing, who knows what in the press box. And it was really the first time that I had any idea what I like wanted to be. And it only happened because of something I probably wouldn't have been good at all, marching in band, and somebody troubleshooting enough to figure out that, hey, let's give him something else to do that would be good for him. Again, like I've been blessed with some really cool teachers, because Mr. Menig in middle school like didn't want me to just clean up after everybody, right? And then Mr. Jastro in high school didn't want me to just be like some add-on to the band. Like, let's actually find him something that he'd be good at. And I just think if we did that in the world, it's not charity, right? It's not giving something to somebody. It's finding their value and finding their skill. And the more and more I think about it, guys, the more it's why I like really good managers and coaches in sports, because you have a roster of 100. If you know that some guy can be a whale of a special teamer, you got a real diamond in the rough there that you can use. Like the Steve Taskers of the world are legit people who legit make champions. And if you just figure out what somebody can do, you're just in such a better place than if you're just stabbing at what they can't do.
Yeah, it's funny when you were describing that. I was thinking of that's a great coach is supposed to get the most out of their players, right? And you
Yeah.
had the band coach, or I don't know the right terminology because I never did it, band instructor, band coach, whatever it is.
Yeah.
He accidentally put you in. I mean, you've had a whatever 30-year run since then, or 25-year run since then of just crushing it at what he did, just being a good coach.
Isn't that crazy that one experience like that can make such a complete and utter difference? And it absolutely has. But yeah, you find coaches who are always looking to see what a person can do. And it's actually rare, like I know you played for people, and everybody's played for somebody who was like, yeah, that dude kind of sucks, right? Or he can't do this that I really want him to do. And you end up loving the people who figure out what you're good at.
Yeah, and even how easy it is, how easy it would have been for that band coach or anything, sports coach, to just like kind of hide a player or somebody who can't do the good job. It's so much easier to hide them in the third string special teams, scout team, whatever, versus actually putting them in a position to succeed.
Yeah, like what if you have a really slow receiver who has great hands? Like put him in the slot, see what happens, or like overload a
Yeah.
side, whatever it might be. I mean, you just there's a place and time for just about everybody.
When did you decide that you were going to be a sports announcer?
Ooh. You know, it's so amazing to, as I hear you ask these questions, the amount of people who do interviews that don't ask direct questions, right? The best route to a really good answer is a very direct question. And I just like, yeah, let's get after it. Like um, I think the answer was in high school, because I was really fortunate to have a high school radio station. And so it was a place to go hang out after school for me, and to figure out that I could be really, really good at something. Because I think one of the hardest things to be with a disability is also highly competitive to the point of boiling over. Like if I were an athlete, I would have been, McEnroe-esque, I think, in my temper, because I really don't like losing at things. But if I play sports, I'm probably going to lose a bunch. It's just a fact of life. It's the vessel that carries my body that is not really, built like a linebacker. And spending the time to get really great at that just seems a little fruitless to me. And so radio was the first place that I ever felt like I could be with as little ego as possible, I say this because I mean it at the very core of the definition of the word, that I felt like I could be pioneering. I felt like I could be somebody who did something really, really good, right? And that's no guarantee, but it was because I disappeared. Like people didn't see me when I sat down to do games on the radio. Their first impression of me was my voice, and that flips the world completely on its head. When you hear somebody for the first time rather than see them, or you experience in a sensory way the most, I guess, acceptable quote unquote version of them, it changes everything. I mean, it's why it's so important that we have the software you have, Tim, that we can hear your voice. I mean, I remember at SU they had a camp for kids with CP who were nonverbal, and the initial version of that software was just like robot voice, right? And I know it's not perfect, but I've talked to you enough that I hear you. And it's so important to have that. And people then heard me first before they saw me. And I think that's really important because it gives you the opportunity to be great. Because when people see you first, in my experience, in my case as a sports announcer, even if they're not going to try to discount, they might, they might. And so it's why I've become so infatuated with the NBC show, The Voice, because all the auditions are blind, right? And so I just love the idea that how you say something, how you phrase something, can just change people's perceptions and say like, oh no, he can do this. So that happened for me in high school when I was around people who really cared about the details. And it gave me the chance to feel like I could be, in the top half of something. Because generally, that, other than like spelling bees, like what, where is the market for the physical stature that I had, especially when you're a kid? It just didn't really exist.
Did you have a sportscaster or two that you looked up to or you heard talk that inspired you?
Yeah, I mean that's why it was crazy to be the White Sox announcer for the 8 years I did it, because Hawk Harrelson, the legendary White Sox announcer who was doing it when I was a kid, like I used to run around doing impressions of Hawk Harrelson. Like I'd run around like gym class and be like, "You can put it on the board, yes," and kids are like, "You're a dork." And it's obviously not the greatest way to make friends, just yelling catchphrases of sportscasters, but that was where I started, and then we all know a lot of the guys who came through Syracuse, and I'm sure you've met a lot of them, but like Sean McDonough has been an unbelievable mentor to me. Mike Tirico, Ian Eagle have been great to me. And so once I got to college, I really immersed myself in the idea of, hey, let's be a connoisseur of sportscasting. And so, a ton of people, those are just a couple of the headliners. Like Sean and I were at an event last week as we sit here and talk about this at SU. And he reminded me, and he was so generous to say it in front of the students, but he reminded me that when I sent him a tape, he, instead of just sending email notes, called me out of the blue and was like, hey, like, give it a couple years before you take my job. And I will always appreciate Sean doing that and saying that and taking the time to make the phone call. Bob Costas called me right after I was done with college to go over a tape. And I just, I've had a lot of people who've invested in my career, and they mean a great deal to me. But it started with Hawk Harrelson and impressions of Hawk Harrelson, and Sean may or may not, depending on the day, like my impression of him. But like I don't know if you remember. Do you remember when Mark Johnson for a year was the voice of the Orange, the title winning season in 2003? Do you remember the name at all?
Sure.
Dude, he's got like the lowest voice in the history of the world. So I would run around campus and be like, hey, Mark Johnson, how you doing? Great to meet you. And just tinkering with people's voices has helped me so much figure out what mine is.
Your impressions are spot on. Did you tell anyone that it was your dream to be an announcer?
I mean, I think people knew. I was, you guys are asking these questions, and I'm realizing that I was like super naive as a kid. I was just like, oh yeah, I'm going to do this as long as I can. And then, then I'll go to college and whatever. But I think when it came to me as a dream was when I was looking at colleges, because I then figured out that, from being from Chicago, I didn't really know a lot about Syracuse, but then I realized that Syracuse was the place to go if you wanted to be a sports announcer. There was that whole class of Mike Tirico, Sean McDonough, Costas, Marv Albert, Ian, Marty Glickman. All these people had already been through and made it big before I had come of the age where I had to decide on whether or not I was, where I was going to go to college. And so I think when I finally expressed that was when the college application process started to happen. I mean, I knew I liked doing it as an extracurricular thing, and I like craved more of it. And I started to really watch announcers. But I don't think I expressed it as a dream until the college experience happened, the application process. And then once you get to that station as a student, everybody's dream is to be the next Bob Costas. And it's very much like being, a top 100 football recruit. And you show up and you're like, man, I was so good at Clay Chalkville High School in Alabama, and I could sack all the guys that I wanted to because everybody else on the offensive line was terrible and couldn't handle me. Then you show up at Alabama and there are 7 of you as freshmen, and then there are like 12 juniors and seniors, and you're 93rd on the depth chart. And then suddenly you got to ask yourself, like, oh, am I equipped to actually get better at this? And I think that's where Syracuse really came in, as a place that encourages you to get better and better as the days go on, at our craft as well.
How soon did you begin announcing high school sports on the radio?
It was pretty quick. It was right after that band thing happened. I mean, I think it was like later that semester or quarter that they had an open house sort of thing. I don't even remember how I figured out that radio station existed. But I found out, and it was that might have been later that year. That was freshman year. So it actually might have been the beginning of the next year that I joined up with the radio station, but it was pretty quick. And then, once you get to Syracuse, it's like everybody's going to that informational meeting. So it was a lot better advertised. I actually don't remember who told me that the high school had a radio station, but I figured it out somehow. Maybe there was a course in the course catalog, but it was pretty quickly thereafter.
Was there any competition for the job?
No, I was the best. So no, I would say in high school, there were a couple of people who I became friends with. And when you're an underclassman, right, you're not going to get all the opportunities right away in whatever you're doing. So I kind of had to wait around, but with how much I cared about it, they put me on the air pretty quickly. But there were a couple people who really loved sports, and we got to do games together, and it worked out great, and we have remained friends. But in college, the competition was, people laugh at this when I say it, but WAER Syracuse is one of the most competitive places that exists, I would say, still in the country. And it's a bunch of like radio nerds running around being like really fascistic to one another, right? But when you show up and there are 15 freshmen and there's actual competition to get on the air, and like if you aren't good, they actually cut you. Like WAER doesn't take everybody. They do it first, but if you're not improving steadily enough, it's basically like AAA umpires. You just kind of wash out and then go do your own thing. And it's ridiculous, right? People always say like the most interesting stuff to watch is when the stakes are very low, but they feel high, right? Like Parks and Recreation worked as a TV series because it's just local government. But Amy Poehler's character cares so darn much about building this park that it's hilarious. We're the same. We cared so much about what verb tense people are using and like active verbs and like description and all this stuff. And you're like, there's a whole university out there that's doing its own thing, that you're just this little speck of dust. But it is an amazing environment. People care so much. And so there was this endless competition of who's going to get to do this great road trip, who's going to get to go to the Maui Invitational, who's going to get to do the lacrosse Final Four. And it really like Wa- Watching people who are like 5'10", 150 yell at each other like they are football players is endlessly joyful.
Looking back on your early days, were you good at announcing?
Oh, I thought I was. Everybody shows up there thinking they're good. Like, I was the best broadcaster in my high school. Nobody cares. Right. And I will say I was very fortunate to have people early in my career at that radio station at Syracuse invest a lot of time in me and show me that details matter. I mean, I think all anybody wants in the world, if you're not a person who's just going to walk in and impress people by your stature, is for details to matter. It's the only avenue by which there's a ladder to climb for people who are not immediately impressive physically. And it starts to sound like, I'm pitting the haves and the have-nots in terms of beauty, and that's not what I mean. I was grateful to get to go to a place that was not at all about politics. It was just, are you good? If you are, you'll end up on the air. And it is sort of like the last meritocracy. Politics, and I don't mean like national politics. I'm not going to talk about the election, but like politics and infighting in whatever corporate job you do, it matters if you cozy up to the partner of the firm. It matters if you go to drinks with the accountant who runs the place. Like, that all matters in this place. And I think that's why I have such a fondness for Syracuse University and that radio station especially. That is the type of place that just means so much to somebody who wants to be great and just wants people to look past the first thing they see about him. And so it's near and dear to my heart to have a place that will just say, like, yeah, if you're good, we'll put you on the air. And it's kind of been, the whole range of my career, right? Like, yeah, it might take a little while for people to understand, but ESPN's put me on TV, Fox put me on TV, the White Sox, the Detroit Tigers. I mean, the question will always remain until somebody does it. Like, would they have a person with a disability do their biggest event? Right? That has not happened, in part because I'm 41, but in part because it hasn't happened yet. And so I do fight with this in my head still, and I've not really expressed this because it sounds like I'm saying, like, well, they need to make that decision. It's not about that. I I want to challenge myself to be as good as humanly possible and force somebody's hand to say, the number one thing is yours. That is the only thing really remaining in my career, is somebody saying, you are going to do our biggest event. And that is as much incumbent on me to make the work that good as it is for somebody to say, you know what? We are going to do that. And it's why I'm so grateful to the Detroit Tigers, who, saw me as a commodity that they were interested in that could elevate their show, and we could do it together and say, yeah, above all the other people in the world, they had 100+ able-bodied people, quote unquote, apply for their job last offseason, and they came to me, and we struck a deal. And I don't say it because I'm looking for somebody to give me a role because I have a disability. All I would ask is that people treat the work that I do the same as, and we have level playing fields as, the people who don't have disabilities. And if my work grows to that level and people believe that, then I would hope at some point somebody would say, you're our number one guy.
Did you sound like you do now when you were at Syracuse? And if you did, were you upset at all that you didn't get to announce football and men's basketball?
Uh, I always am competitive, so I will always want to do the big sports right away. I ended up as a student, as a senior, getting to do a bunch of football and men's basketball. But yeah, I mean, there was definitely a pecking order, a hierarchy that came with it. But if I played tapes for you of what I sounded like back then, you'd be like, what in the world is that? I cared so much about what I was saying, vocabulary, details of description, and things like that, that I just didn't really pay attention to how I sounded. I mean, so you have to kind of hunt for your voice, I think, as an announcer. I think you have to figure out what your range is. And I think one of the traps young announcers fall into is they think that what they have as their baseline voice is it. But I think that there's a range. It's why I like doing impressions so much, because it forces me out of what I sound like, quote unquote, normally, to then go do something else. But no, I did not sound like that. I actually, an NBA announcer who's still working in the NBA, saved my career, you could argue, because he heard a tape of mine a couple years after college and basically said to me, I don't know it verbatim, but he basically said to me, what you're saying is good. How you're saying it is boring. And I thought, well, you're an ass, right? Like, that's not nice at all. But I then realized that he was saying, like, you have to perform, you have to be engaging, and you have to, if people are going to really like lock in on the game along with those big moments, you have to be excited. I mean, Tim, like, as a football analyst, when somebody makes a huge play, I could feel it through the TV because of you and your partner. And so you have to be able to feel it. And I was trying so hard to be like detached that I was leaving a bunch of emotion on the table. And I think that's the hardest part of learning to be an announcer, is realizing that you have to be emotionally attached. And it's why, I said what I said earlier, but when I see the smile cross your face, that's all I need to know about the human emotion that we're feeling and having this conversation. Like, a little tip off of how much the human connection matters is what I was missing as an announcer. And now I just see it everywhere.
Jason, did anyone at Syracuse recognize your potential and look out for you?
Yeah, it's funny. My peers did. My friends in the grade, there's you always, every year, there's an application process to run the place. And there's no bigger tyrant than a 21-year-old sportscaster who gets to decide where his friends are going. Because we don't have power in other walks of life. So we just decide to be iron fisted in our decision making of who gets to go call the Providence game or whatever it is. So in that process, I applied, and there were a couple people who interviewed, and a couple friends of mine at the radio station basically went to the guy in charge and said, you're an idiot if you don't make him the sports director. And there's this whole litany of people who've done that in my career, but specifically at that university, it was friends of mine and peers of mine. And that's the thing I have always treasured most. And this is not to say that I don't care about the audience, because I do. But when my peers, when people who I looked up to as a young sports announcer believe that this plays, that the work is viable and skilled, that's what makes my heart feel fullest.
You exude so much confidence. Did you gain that gradually over the years? And were you a different Jason Benetti when you came out of SU than when you entered?
Can you just be the person who interviews me all the time? Thanks. Like, yeah, that's true. I was totally different in the confidence department. I used to get really angry about the disability thing. And one of my friends tells this story, my friend Lauren, that we went to go do like a fake stand-up, like you'd be on the television news at some event. I think it was like the fairgrounds or something, for a class. And it took me like half an hour to do a 2-minute television hit, because I was so nervous about being on TV. I was so worried about people seeing me. And I did it backward. A lot of people have confidence and they're good on the air because of it. I was a really underconfident person going into school. Then I realized that I actually could get good at calling games. And my personality, you would argue, came out more with a headset on than with it off. I was a pretty reserved kid until I was, I don't know, 13, 14, maybe 15 years old. And then I kind of reverse engineered it and became a personality or somebody with a personality when I went on the air. And so I think I kind of did it backward, but John Mulaney, the comedian, does a bit about how college is the place that you go to try out new personalities. And I kind of feel like radio and TV is the place that I went to try out new personalities.
Unrelated, but Syracuse alumni and locals know this is an important question. Do you have a favorite place to eat at Syracuse?
Okay. So yes, and it's a little under the radar. So I mean, they're all the old standbys and all that. So I'm gonna save that. Like everybody can do their dinosaur recommendation or whatever, right? But I used to live with Kevin Brown, actually, who's the voice of the Orioles now. We did the Chiefs together for a couple years, and not far from where we lived in Liverpool is Avicoli's, the Italian restaurant in Liverpool. And I know there's great Italian everywhere in Syracuse. So like people are going to argue and be like, Joey's is better or whatever, right? But I loved Avicoli's. And I loved Avicoli's so much because they do like a create your own pasta. It's angel hair, vodka sauce, chicken for me, and then side salad, honey mustard dressing. Like the woman who ran the place, the host at the front, knew me so well because I just go in there either with friends or I'd sit there and read myself or whatever. Like they knew the order to the point that when my last day with the Chiefs, Kevin, who's a very close friend of mine and an extremely talented announcer, and I love him to death, but he decided that he was going to do a bunch of like congratulations for moving on from the Chiefs messages for me from friends in the industry, my parents, and all these people. He went to Avicoli's and had the woman record a thing and be like, we're going to miss you. Like, you're killing our business. Don't leave, sort of thing, whatever it was. But I love that restaurant so much that she was part of the, Denise is her name. She was part of the farewells from my departure from AAA baseball.
Did you do law school as a backup plan in case you didn't make it as a sports broadcaster, and why Wake Forest Law School?
I interned in Chicago one of the summers when I was in college for a radio show, a sports talk radio show called Boers and Bernstein. And Dan Bernstein, one of the hosts, has remained a very close friend. And he always talked about his parents. His dad, I think, is an attorney, and he has attorneys in the family. And he always talked about how his family wanted him to go to law school, but he didn't because he didn't want to have a safety net. He didn't want to have a backup plan. But when I was at Syracuse, I took comm law with David Rubin, who was then the dean of Newhouse at the time. And the class was like so interesting to me. And a friend of mine from college actually went and took the LSAT right after college. So we kind of studied for it at the same time. And I decided to take the test. And I got a good enough score that I felt like I could go to a school that was good. And so I ended up deciding to do it because I just wanted to keep learning. Like I'm fascinated by the world and how it works. And I like taking classes, like I don't know if a lot of people enjoy that rigmarole, but I do. Like I enjoy that. I enjoy the guidance. And I've had great teachers in the past. So I decided to do it. And Wake Forest, because I had gotten a job as the basketball announcer at High Point University in the Big South Conference, a pretty small Division I school. And so I was living in Winston-Salem at the time, and I figured if Wake Forest would let me go to classes while also doing games, it would be the perfect marriage of both. I didn't want a backup plan. I wanted to somehow do both. And so, Dan, the sports talk host I was talking about, told me like, just make sure, it's not a backup. And so I always had in my head, if I'm doing a game, I'm doing a game and it's the only thing. If I'm doing law school, I'm doing law school and it's the only thing. And I had to kind of segment them from each other. And I never, ever, ever let them be an excuse for one another because I was deathly afraid of it being a backup plan. Like the way you said it is exactly how I framed it in my mind. Like I did not want a backup plan. I had no interest in that. And if I ever started using class as an excuse for not being ready for a game, I was dragging myself into that vortex.
Having sports announcing as your kind of not right as your main plan, and not that law was backup, but you kind of had that. You must have had some confidence or felt good that you could really make it in that profession, right? I mean, was there a moment when you're at Syracuse that you call a game, or maybe it was after Syracuse? You have a moment where you called a game or got some feedback that you thought, okay, I can really do this?
I knew that I knew what good sounded like, but I didn't know. You don't know in like a performance industry yet if what you think it's gonna be can actually come out of your mouth. Like what good is, I knew because I listened to a ton of announcers and I studied it and all that. But until you start to sound like that, I don't think it strikes you in that way. And I would say, getting to do basketball games at ESPN in 2011 and realizing that, it's another game, was really powerful for me. But I was Syracuse Albany in the 2011 season, and my friend Kevin Brown, who I mentioned before, sent me a text, and I got it after the game, and it just said, "You belong." And it's cheesy to think this, but like it made me pretty emotional because when somebody that you respect and has a brain for this says like, yeah, like that sounded right. I think that probably was the first time that I thought, okay, like now this is a rocket ship. Like let's go ahead and do this because when nobody's putting you on TV, and I shouldn't say nobody because Pete did in Syracuse, and that was hugely valuable, and I love him for it. But until a network puts you on TV as somebody who walks and looks like I do, you don't really know that they're gonna. You can't know that until it
Mhm.
actually happens. My fear was always, there's this movie Little Miss Sunshine. You ever see Little Miss Sunshine?
I don't think
It's
I saw that one, but
so it's a movie about this young girl who wants to be in a beauty pageant, and she's kind of like larger as a girl, but her family just like lets her go do the dream. And her brother is not speaking. He writes stuff down over the course of the movie, but we find out over the course of the movie that he wants to be a fighter pilot. And like that's all he's driving toward. He's trying to get to school only to be a fighter pilot. It's his only motivation. And the daughter, at one point, they're at a gas station as they're driving along, and she gets one of these little booklets that's got like quizzes in it and games and whatnot. And she opens to the page where it's like those little red green colorblind things that are like, what number is this? Right. And she shows it to him, and he just shrugs, and he has no idea. And we find out he's red green colorblind. And if you're colorblind, you can't be a fighter pilot. He realizes this, gets out of the van, speaks his first words of the movie, and it's just him screaming obscenities. Right. And I was always afraid after watching that movie, like you thought my takeaway from Forrest Gump was ridiculous. Like this takeaway is also ridiculous. My fear was that somebody would say that my walk or my eyes were the equivalent of being red green colorblind for a fighter pilot. And I never wanted it to be something people use to say no. Like they can discount the work, they can do whatever, but until somebody puts you on TV at a network level and says we're going to do this, nobody has. And so I think that moment to be on an ESPN network was really important for my confidence.
Please take us on your journey from law school to your dream job of being the voice of the Chicago White Sox.
Yeah, it was. So I graduated law school in 2011, and at the time I was doing AAA baseball in Syracuse. So I was the voice of the Chiefs from late '09 when Bob McElligott got the job as the Blue Jackets radio announcer to 2014 when I left to go do further ESPN stuff and Westwood One Radio. And so um, those years in between, I was doing some ESPN basketball, which then became basketball and football, and then AAA baseball, and sending my stuff to as many people as possible and working on my tape and working on my sound and all of that. And then when I left Syracuse, I moved to the DC area for what only turned out to be 9 months. I was just going to fly out to ESPN events from DC, and I lived in Arlington, Virginia, Northern Virginia there. And um, so I was doing ESPN football and basketball. And I got a note from a friend of mine who was then the TV voice of the Cubs, Len Casper, who told me that the White Sox were going to be looking for a new announcer. And he encouraged me to call the White Sox and put my hat in the ring. And I always felt weird about doing that because it's like, well, of course, everybody wants the job. You'll be one of 100 people calling, and it's annoying. But I left a message, and the guy who ended up hiring me, Brooks Boyer, called me back and said, "Yeah, we've heard your name. We're interested. Is there any chance you're going to be in the Chicago area at some point?" And I said, "Well, by happenstance, we have a high school reunion for the media department." And so I was coming in maybe 3 weeks later, something like that. I interviewed with the White Sox that week that I came into town. And then I found out a couple months later that I was one of the finalists. They closed for the entire holiday season. So the last 2 weeks of December, I didn't hear anything. And I didn't know at the time that they actually closed their offices and basically didn't do anything with operations. So I thought I didn't get the job because I had met Jerry Reinsdorf in person, the owner of the White Sox, chairman. And I just thought, like, did I do something wrong? Because it's been radio silence. But it turned out they just closed the offices. So the Monday after they opened the office, or Tuesday, I got a phone call and they offered me the job. And it was a very, very exciting time. And obviously things have changed since, and I've left the White Sox, but they gave me an opportunity that nobody else had given me at that point. And I'll always be grateful to be able to do games where I grew up going.
What was getting that call like?
Oh, I mean, I got the phone call, and it really did feel surreal. It felt like I was experiencing something else, something that somebody else was meant to experience, is that the way I would say it. Like, you're kind of watching yourself accept a phone call and have your life change because, being the voice of a team, I went from somebody that people are like, "Oh, who's that guy doing that ESPN game? Oh, we kind of like him," whatever it was. And then you become one of two people talking to folks about their baseball team for 162 games. And it was extremely life-changing because, before, the only reason people stared at me before was because of how I walked and how I look. Now, at that point, people then started to look at me and stare at me because they were like, is that Jason Benetti? Or they were still staring at me for the old reasons. But it became much more substantial that I would get recognized, whatever it might be. And I never got into this for recognition. I just wanted to do games and do right by the players and enjoy the craft of calling games. But then suddenly you're thrust into a role that's very public.
Jason, at any time during your journey, did you turn to faith to make sense of it all? The reason I ask is because my diagnosis was my worst nightmare. I had to see a psychiatrist and he prescribed some anxiety medication. I was in a bad way, and I was always a believer, but not really committed to following God's commands. Then I really turned my life over to Jesus, and I started reading the Bible every day, and I feel much better than I did. I recommend it if you're looking for purpose in your life.
Yeah, it's faith is an interesting question for me because I didn't grow up going. My family wasn't a highly religious family, but I've been around an array of people and friends who have been from not religious at all to highly religious. And while I am highly interested in religion as a person, I also am a pretty logical being. And I have yet to figure out exactly what I think the world is after we're gone. And none of us really figures it out, maybe. But I would say the idea that the world is just this separate existence from the heavens, from fate. Like, there is too much coincidental in this world, and there's too much good and joy in this world for there not to be something that's guiding it. I have not yet decided for me what that guidance is, but I would also say that I am one of the most interested people in talking to my friends who are deeply religious because I am fascinated in what their journey is. But I'm just embarking on that journey. And that's what I love most, I think, about the world of religion is that you can search and search and search, and then something happens in life and it immediately crystallizes. And just because that hasn't happened for me yet doesn't mean it's not going to in the future.
Tell us about some of the different jobs you had during your ascension in the industry.
Yeah, maybe the worst job I ever had for the players involved was Little League umpire. I was terrible at it. My strike zone was awful. I thought everything was a strike, and I wanted to go home. So that I was an umpire back in the day, but no, I've had a lot of broadcasting fortune. I've been doing games basically straight on from when I graduated. So um, I did one season of independent baseball near my hometown in Chicago for the Windy City Thunderbolts. Then I went back to Syracuse. I was the number two for Bob McElligott for a year in '06. Then I got my own minor league job in Salem, Virginia, near Roanoke for 2 years, '07, '08. Then I started going to law school, got the job at High Point in 2006. When I moved to Salem, I also got the High Point job there. I was a studio host for a number of colleges through their rights holder. You might remember ISP Sports. They used to run Syracuse's rights. That company hired me to do like Georgia Tech, Notre Dame, Florida State, bunch of different schools, their studio hosting. Then ESPN 2011, I was there from 2011 to 2021, 22. And then Fox Sports 2022 to 2024, your old stomping grounds there. They hired me in 2022. So I've done that for 3 years. I did the White Sox for 8 years and then the Tigers for my first season this past year. So I got old fast. It was like 30 under 30 Liz, Jason Benetti. And now I'm like 45 under 45. And it's just like it loses its luster. You get elderly fast.
Did you have it's probably can't answer this question with all the partners you've had, but did you have any broadcast partners that you had the most fun with? Not necessarily who was like the best, but they had the most fun calling games with?
I've had, like you said, I've had great people, but I miss Bill Walton every day. I loved Bill. His level of crazy, insane, vivid. He's a great basketball player, and he dealt with all these health challenges, had an awful back issue, and he got to some very dark places. But he got out of it, and he had a stutter, and then he learned to speak, and the amount that he overcame was just a beautiful thing. But sitting next to him to do a game, I mean, you'd talk about the Ottoman Empire and acacia trees, and here's a three from Damian Lillard, and then sugar cane, and you're like, what is happening? What is happening here? But his sense of humor and his way of going about sitting next to you and taking you on an adventure was life changing for me. And there would be there was a time I used to fly. The last couple of years, the NBA commissioned me and our producer to fly to San Diego and do games from Bill Walton's living room at his house, NBA games. We do like 4 to 6 a year. And at one point I was talking about a guy, maybe it was Jamal Murray, the point guard for the Nuggets, that he came back from an ACL injury that was pretty gruesome. And Bill turns to me and he goes, "What do you know about physical challenges?" And I was like, come on. He's just like needling me, and he gave me a little wink, right? Like he knows that I know, and we both have had our physical issues, but he gives me this little nod, and I was like, you are unbelievable, man. But it was like talking to a rainbow. It was just so joyous, and he passed away this past June, and I really do. I promise you, I miss him every day.
So I went to the Cerebral Palsy Foundation website and I found your current message on awkward moments. I have had some awkward moments of my own. People talk loud to me and ask my family or nurses if I can hear or if I can understand. I try not to take offense, but it's definitely awkward.
Yeah, it's hard sometimes though, right? I mean, and I know they mean well. But yeah, we did this series of videos called Awkward Moments, which is basically like people coming up to me and saying ridiculous things that you wouldn't say to somebody else. But that's again, I think that's why I like comedy so much, is because I like the ridiculous. I tend to rather laugh at it than anything else. It's hard sometimes because you do realize people are treating you differently, but the relationships you build when people get past it, Tim, you and I talked a number of times at the Dome getting ready for those championship games. And Time Warner wanted a soundbite or two or whatever it might be when you were at Skinny Atlas. And, so many of our relationships are just transactional, and here's a 5-minute conversation here and there and all that. But then you sit down and you talk to somebody and you kind of know if they're the type of person who's going to be able to look past what they're seeing. And I do think there's a depth of understanding once you do get to those people and you do see who the ones that are going to look past it are. And you just immediately become very fast friends. And I do tend to try to look for what the good in every situation is. And I know, like, it doesn't immediately pop up when you type and ask questions using your device. But I'll tell you what, how often in our lives do we actually have silence nowadays? You know what I mean? And I am so used to doing an interview where it's rapid fire and it's like, here's this thing and here's the next thing. And no, there's no chance to be really thoughtful. And I have to say, I know it doesn't happen in the way that you want it to, and nobody would want ALS, but I am struck by the power of the silence in between questions. And I actually think a little more of that would be better for humanity.
Can you talk about the Just Say Hi program for people who don't know what that is?
Yeah, so this program, the Cerebral Palsy Foundation put together a program that they've brought into a bunch of schools now called Just Say Hi, and the whole premise is, how do you start a conversation with somebody with a disability? Well, just say hi. Like, that's a good start. That's as good a start as any. You don't have to be awkward. You don't have to be bizarre. You don't have to like tiptoe around it or be like, what's wrong with you? Sort of thing. Just say hi. And there's a human level that we reach everybody with just the word hi. And, it's funny, there was a little backlash when we came out with it from a very small pocket of people with disabilities that were like, well, I'm more than just hi. Don't just treat me as somebody to say hi to. And I understand that completely. But the whole purpose of it is to get beyond that, right? To start with hello, and then you go from there.
Now, on to our final word segment, where we ask our guests a few rapid fire questions. What was the happiest moment in your life?
Getting the phone call from the Tigers and saying that they wanted me to be the voice of their team. Because before that, it would have been the White Sox. But knowing that somebody went out on a limb and got you as a free agent when you've grown up as somebody who nobody would pick first, like, that's a powerful thing, man.
What is the biggest adversity you've faced?
Oh, I would say probably my own self sometimes. I think you can get in your own head about what you look like, and that can be really hard. But you also know when people are treating you differently. That said, it doesn't really matter. Like, the best thing I can do is make the work as good as possible and force people's hands. But yeah, I think, when you're trying to climb the ladder or get a job, like, losing confidence in yourself is one of the worst things you can do.
What are you most excited about?
Oh, yeah, what might be other than calling games? I never really had aspirations other than calling games, but I've kicked around the idea with a friend of mine of like writing a sitcom and seeing where that goes. What I'm most excited about, though, other than that, is that there are a lot of really good young announcers that can keep this craft going, because I think it's really important to the sports landscape and it's done a lot for me. So having that be the case is important. But if I end up in a writer's room in 5 years for a sitcom, you can say that you had it first.
Okay, the next one is, what advice would you give your younger self?
oh man, don't be so mad at people. It's not always about it's not always about you. I was, and I also, part of the advice that I would give is find more friends with disabilities. I tried so hard to not be somebody who just always went around with the people with disabilities. I didn't want to be the person who was in that group all the time. Like I was afraid of it because I didn't want people to see me as, I guess, and this is hard to say, but like as somebody who only could get friends who had disabilities. It's not about that. It's about finding people who create depth in your life. And so I think part of my advice would be, dude, just like you can be friends with everybody.
The next one is, do you have any book recommendations for the listeners or for us?
One of my favorite books I've read in the last like 7, 8 years is called The Talent Code. It's about little pockets of society that create, just churn out talent. So, like the Brazilian soccer team, there's a voice coach in Texas that they document, and it's just about like how teachers, how systems nurture and create skill out of talent. And I got it actually from Bronco Mendenhall, who was the Virginia football coach. One of the things I do when we meet with football coaches is ask for book recommendations. And I would say that one is very high on my list because it speaks to how places can become really great places.
You're going to think this is like, anyone listening is going to think this is like a read-in setup. I'm literally reading his other book called The Culture Code right now.
Are you really?
Yeah, it's literally on my desk sitting here. That's what I'm reading right now.
No way, dude. Yeah, Dan Coyle, I ended up emailing him actually after I read The Talent Code. And he was, I don't know if he still is, but he was like an assistant something or other consultant with Cleveland with the baseball team. And I've not met him in person yet, but I find it fascinating. Is that newer or is that right around the same time?
I don't even know. We had somebody on the podcast, and it was Jeff Bethke, and he recommended to get it. And so I bought the book, and I don't know, halfway through it. So now I added, every time someone gives us a book recommendation, I add it to my list. So now I've got The Talent Code will be in the queue here.
Love it. Love it.
Last question is, the name of this podcast is Nothing Left Unsaid. Do you have anything that you want to say?
Oof. Yeah, to all of my friends and all of the people who have supported my career or employed me, just because I'm really passionate about improvement and I get really angry when progress doesn't happen at the speed that I think it should happen, and I get angry sometimes when people judge me, that doesn't mean I'm not going to put in the work. The work always is paramount. And I think, other than that message, the most important thing I can convey to anybody who's doing anything is, if you really believe that who you know or what you look like or all of these other superficial things are the only thing or the most important thing in your career, and you spend all this time on LinkedIn rather than honing your craft, just understand that they've put me on television. And so there must still be value in the work, in creating material, in putting something into the world, in developing yourself and creating improvement. And so just realize that if somebody tells you you have to go meet all these other people, do it. But the half an hour you spend on your work and your craft will be the biggest game changer of all.
That's awesome. Jason, the last question I have is, at the end of every podcast, we ask people who are recommendations. And obviously Bob Costas connected us, and his recommendations, we had to get you on here. So I'll ask the same question to you. Who are a couple of people you know personally that you think we have to get on the podcast to tell their story?
That's a good one. So, oh man, I don't want to shortchange anybody. Definitely Kevin Brown, voice of the Orioles. He is so interesting. He, in the last year, has like because he did an impression of the band Blink 182, was the front man for a Blink 182 cover band outside Oriole Park at Camden Yards, and was on stage singing backup for Joan Jett because he just did a silly impression of Blink 182 on an Orioles game. But also, like, his story is so fascinating to me because last year he got suspended by the Orioles for a very ridiculous reason. And like, he didn't even say anything. The whole stadium ended up chanting his name and like, free Kevin Brown, right? And when I first knew him as like the number 2 for the Syracuse Chiefs, for me, he's like this quiet, sort of like mouse-like, meek guy, and he's turned into this huge personality and this really interesting guy. So I would say, and he did Time Warner Cable high school football as well, so he's got, a Syracuse guy, all those touchstones. I would say he's number 1. And another guy this is totally different place to go, and I don't know what he's doing now. I haven't talked to him for a bunch of years, but for an event, I interviewed Justin Gallegos, who is a runner with cerebral palsy, who was the first person to get an endorsement deal from Nike with a disability. So Justin is a track and field athlete who Phil Knight got to know, and they gave him, and he earned an endorsement deal with Nike. And he's a runner with CP, and he's done more with his body than I would ever dream of. So I haven't talked to him in years, but I do think subject matter wise, he'd be a fascinating discussion.
Jason Benetti, you are an inspiration to us all. You had a dream, and you have realized that dream against all odds. Thank you so much for sharing your story with us today. As you know, I am always rooting for you.
Tim, sincerely, it is great to see you. It's been way too long. Thank you. And Troy, thank you for having me. And I hope that your next guest isn't 15 minutes late to the podcast. No, sincerely, this was my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for such thoughtful questions. Sincerely.
Yeah, thanks for joining. It's been awesome. Good to hear your story, and it's so crazy when you hear everyone just turns on the TV and sees you, hears you there, turns on the radio, sees you, hears you. You don't hear about how much goes into it. You're announcing in Salem. You're announcing it like you're. It's really like the classic overnight, the 10-year overnight success, right?
Yeah, I appreciate it. I'm still mad at you guys for beating Solvay by 100 that one game we did. It was like 95-3, and Dale and I were like, guys, like, this is not fun to watch anymore. You guys were too good. It was fun to watch you guys play.
All right, well, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate
Thank you. That doesn't have to be for air, but I wanted to say it because you guys, that offense was ridiculous.
If you enjoyed today's episode, consider supporting the podcast for free by subscribing on your favorite podcast platform, leaving a review, and sharing it with your friends. Your support means the world to us. This episode of Nothing Left Unsaid is brought to you by 11 Labs. Their groundbreaking technology makes a huge difference, and we're grateful for their support. To learn more, visit 11labs.io. A substantial portion of our sponsorship proceeds go to tackleals.com, funding cutting-edge ALS research. If you'd like to join the fight and contribute, visit tackleals.com. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time on Nothing Left Unsaid.